Hey guys, welcome back to another Q&A, and it is September 27th, 2022. We are officially in fall. So the show season is not quite winding down yet. We still have quite a few shows left, but we will be getting to the end of it before we know it. But we do have some good questions this week. So let's jump right into it. First one, sleep and sexual function while in a deficit, how to improve both. It's a very broad question. I mean, improving sleep is going to be like improving sleep out of a deficit. The only, the difference is obviously going to be there's an additional stressor, which is the deficit potentially, right? It depends on, how severe is the deficit, how long have you been in the deficit, how lean are you, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, some people may notice an improvement in sleep when they start a deficit because their body's functioning better. If they've been in a higher calorie phase for a while and their body's kind of systemically stressed, that going into the deficit may actually improve both of these things. So it really depends on the context of the deficit itself. But if you notice that you get to a point in that deficit where these things are going down, then that means what? That means that your body is becoming more stressed. Now, sleep routine is not really going to vary from a surplus to a deficit. We're talking about things like sleep and wake time. We're talking about things like light exposure, not cutting into your sleep to get up and do fasted cardio if you can avoid it, things like that. In reality, it's really still about systemic stress control. So things that you can do that will improve both are things like properly auto-regulating your training, refeeding, taking extra days off when you need to, like literally listening to biofeedback, right? Now, of course, there comes a time in a deficit where potentially unavoidable for some things to kind of suffer a little bit, but that really should only be reserved for really extreme leanness situations. I mean, for me, if everything's really dialed, I can pretty much sleep through the night with maybe one wake up, even when I'm extremely lean and close to a contest. I know a lot of people sleep really falls off, but that's telling you something about systemic stress. I mean, if you listen to that and you manage it, you're probably going to improve your body composition too. Again, things aren't really different. Now, hormonal piece in the sexual function, especially, if there's any enhancements in play, that's going to play into it. Not crashing estrogen is going to be a big one. If you're using any type of enhancements, so consider that. Maybe stimulants being a vasoconstrictor, probably not so much, but I guess that could potentially be part of it as well. Okay, next one. What is your experience with reverse diets post-contest? Is it just a waste of time to titrate calories up gradually versus straight up to estimated maintenance? What are the different scenarios? Okay. Yeah, okay, so listen. So I've done podcasts on this, and I've talked about this a lot. There's a lot of scenarios, and there's a lot of reasons why I might put someone straight up to maintenance, why I might use a more gradual approach. But I'll give you a couple easy ones and a couple maybe what I would consider the most common. So first off, if we look at the science and we look at the anecdotal evidence, is it really useful to gradually titrate up calories? Probably not. So we know that. We know that we need to gain a certain amount of body fat back. We need a certain amount of calories. We need, et cetera, body fat, right? Actual body fat. Probably not. However, what we're really looking at here probably is more of a psychological environment consideration more than anything. So if I do have someone that's on board with it, and I don't think there's going to be any type of pushback or we can agree, whatever, right? I'm probably going to try to get them up to that maintenance or slight surplus pretty quickly. Now, it might take me a couple of increases to kind of figure out what their metabolic adaptation is going to be, because it's going to most people it's going to adapt back upward, right? So to figure that out, but outside of that, it's not like I'm going to sit there and make 10 to 15 carb increases every week or something like that. Now, if psychologically it may be beneficial to the person to go a little bit slower, that could be a potential scenario. However, sometimes when you go too slow and your body is really sending you a lot of skewed psychological or emotional hunger signals and psychological hunger signals, and you're binging or something like that, or overeating massively on your weekends or whatever, then you're kind of back to square one. You're probably overeating your maintenance calories by so much anyhow that you'd be better off just going up to maintenance and letting those hunger signals level off. And that way you're not binging and then restricting, essentially. So that's another scenario. But I mean, those are kind of the main considerations. But yeah, I mean, in an ideal situation, we're going to get the person up to optimal function, whatever that body fat is for that person, and it's going to vary person to person. Whatever that is for that person, whatever that caloric point is for that person, getting systemic stress down via activity reduction, cardio, etc. Right? So that's ideal, but we're talking about psychology too. So that's really where you have a couple different possible scenarios. How much can overthinking impact your decisions in contest prep, peak week, or show day? I'm not sure how you would quantify that, but certainly could be a little or a lot. That's going to impact your decision making in any scenario, really, especially when we're talking about something as emotionally driven as your body composition, right? That's a huge driving factor. I mean, that's literally what I battle and what a lot of coaches battle every single day is overthinking. It's no secret. That's a huge issue with this community. It's a huge issue in general, but it's definitely a huge issue in this like highly driven type of individual, very type A individual, neurotic, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to impact your decision making a ton, and it's going to impact your progress a ton. And especially if you're paying someone, you should probably listen to them. That's kind of the point. So overthinking is the death of progress. That is for sure. There's probably not one single thing that's more deleterious to your progress than overthinking and stress, because that is stress, right? Running a compound like EQ into a show, pros and cons. Yeah, I mean, it could be an option. It aromatizes a little bit, not as much as testosterone, but some, maybe half as much. I mean, there's probably better options. It could potentially be an option if you don't react well to potentially like a DHT type compound or something, but which those generally don't aromatize, masteron, primobolan, right? But I think there's probably better options. It's not that it would never have a place, but it probably would only be an option if it's the only thing that you react well to, I guess is my point. Cons, there are better options probably. That's really the only con. Pros, I mean, the only pros would be if that's the only thing that you react well to. So, wouldn't be a typical go-to. Training and contest prep. Increase frequency, less frequency to allow better recovery to the muscles. Everything remains the same, or what? Well, think about what we're trying to accomplish with training and contest prep. So first, mainly we're trying to accomplish muscle retention, right? So we know that the amount of volume and workload that we need for muscle retention is going to be less generally than what we need for creating hypertrophy adaptation. So we know that. So do we need to increase volume? Probably not. Do we need lower volume? Potentially, yes. Now, frequency is kind of going to be, you're asking about frequency, not volume. So frequency is just alluding to like how many times per week are you doing something, right? That probably is going to be less important than the amount of total volume that you're doing. Now, there's potentially some benefit in moderate to higher frequency in terms of recovering, so you're not like thrashing a muscle with 20 sets within one single session and you're spreading it out, right? I wouldn't really probably change the frequency a whole lot. And frankly, if you are doing some type of specialization or prioritization type splits, you're still probably going to want to train those quote unquote weaker muscle groups, or the ones that require more volume, with more volume, even though you're in prep, because the maintenance volume for those muscles is probably still going to be higher. So you're largely training with the same kind of split, right? You don't necessarily need to change that a lot. You probably just need to adjust the volume and then potentially adjust intensity parameters depending on the person and depending on what their CNS resilience and stuff is, and where they are at and where they're at in prep. That would be things to consider. Of course, there's going to be variance person to person, but you're talking about the muscle recovering. I think really nervous system CNS recovery is probably what we're going to be more concerned about. If you're eating sufficient protein and you're not in like a massive, ridiculous deficit, then your muscles are probably recovering. That's what I would think about in that situation. Understanding when to deploy fat burners, like X number of weeks out, when to take time of day, and stacking GH, Clin, Yohimbine, etc. Well, that's a lot. that's a lot there, but we'll just do real quick cliff notes. So when to deploy. You didn't ask about exogenous thyroid, so we're not going to do that one, but maybe that's under, et cetera. Well, Clen and yohimbine. Think about, so stimulant-based, fat loss supplementation that's going to stimulate your central nervous system. You probably want to consider duration of time you're using that, because if you're also using low caffeine and all this stuff and you're already kind of stressed, then you're just stacking it on your CNS, right? GH could be the whole time. I mean, really all you're looking for there is free fatty acid mobilization. Take it upon waking. That's going to be a baseline insulin state. It's going to help with free fatty acid mobilization. You do some kind of non-glucose intensive activity like walking, right? Fasted, steady state, whatever. And it will help utilize some of those free fatty acids. That's probably the most beneficial way to do it. It does take a few hours to potentially fully mobilize those fatty acids depending on the person. So if you can have a little window in there where you're fasted and doing the activity, that's probably helpful. Usually 2 units, maybe somewhere in that range, is going to pretty much maximally mobilize the fatty acids. So somewhere in that range, subcutaneously. Could maybe get a second dose in for mobilization at the end of the day or somewhere in there if you have a period where you're fasting enough, but that gets tricky. And I should also say, like, off-season application is going to be different, so food timing is going to be totally different. But anyhow, Clen and yohimbine, that's going to be probably reserved more for, I would try to at least get into the single-digit weeks if possible. Somewhere, I think once you get into the single-digit weeks, probably anywhere in there is pretty much fair game if you're noticing adaptation. But you can deploy them in strategically in that you don't necessarily need the maximum dose right away, or don't necessarily need to put both in right away. Or if you do put both of them in right away, maybe at half the maximal dose that you're going to use. That's what, either A, put them both in at the same time and maybe half the dose, right? Or a lower dose, or put one in and then put the other in. So Clen being more specific to beta receptors and yohimbine being more specific to alpha receptors, they're complementing each other, right? With Clen, super long half-life, AM dose as early as possible is pretty much your best way to go, because you want as little left in your system at night as possible. And that's why, I'm just not really a fan of large dosages. If you're going to use it, keep it small, because if it's impacting your sleep, then it's not really, you're kind of losing some of the benefit there because your sleep sucks. Yohimbine, shorter half-life, that's going to really complement some of that free fatty acid mobilization. So fasted state, get that activity in the morning, etc. But yeah, once you probably get into those single-digit weeks, and again, these are just arbitrary numbers, but maybe somewhere in there, you're pretty much fair game to start deploying them if you're noticing a lot of adaptation. At that point, that's where these tools come into play. So that would be my take, but always consider long-term outlook. If you're deploying them at 10 weeks out or 9 weeks out, then maybe not at the maximum dose. If you're deploying them at 5 weeks out, maybe you go in at a little higher dose right away because you don't need them as long or something like that, right? Last one. Man, a lot of good questions today. Injury recovery and prep with VPC 157 and TB 500. Yeah, they could be deployed at any time. They could be used in prep. There's not really any downside to that. They work similarly, but they aren't exactly the same. So they, increase blood flow via vessels to the muscle, into the tissue that's injured. BPC may be a little more localized than TB, but they definitely complement each other depending on the injury. If you're talking like muscle tissue and tear and like joint connective tissue, use both, because they kind of target, they both target all the tissues, but they may target the tissues a little differently. You'd probably get the most benefit from using both of them. Dosages, you're going to see a lot of different dosages, but TB might be a couple milligrams a couple times a week, maybe higher. People go really high with it. It just depends. BPC generally daily, maybe 500 micrograms a couple times a day or somewhere in there, or even maybe a little less depending on quality. But yeah, there's no real downside to it. If you needed to use them, it's likely to speed up your injury recovery, especially when you're in prep in a deficit where the materials needed to recover these injuries are suboptimal, right? Because you are in a deficit, and you are in a deficit of nutrients potentially. So fair game for sure. I don't see any problem with that. All right, that's it. Great questions. I appreciate everyone submitting, and we'll talk to you guys next time.